All right, we've got quite a bit to get through, so I'm going to get started. And my name is Stacey DeCalma. I work in the sector capacity team here at QCOS, or Queensland Council of Social Service. And it's my pleasure to present this webinar today. QCOS and DESBT have been working together for quite a few years now to support the community services sector in writing applications, and specifically for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, which is a brilliant Queensland Government initiative with some really positive outcomes, which we have seen for quite a few years now. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail today about Skilling Queenslanders for Work as an initiative. We will be using it as a context for referring to tender writing and how we craft a really good tender response. But if you're looking for specific information about Skilling Queenslanders for Work as an initiative and some of the more nitty-gritty details, and you haven't been able to come along to the Introduction to Skilling Queenslanders for Work webinar, which happened a few weeks ago, the recording's on our website. So please go and watch that if you're interested in some more detail about the initiative and the funding itself. All right. Now, before I get into the content, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today. For me, that's the Yuggera people. Pay my respects to their elders past and present. And of course, I extend that acknowledgement to any First Nations people on the line today. And it would be fantastic if you could share in the chat who you are, the organisation you're from, and the land that you're on today, so we can get a good snapshot of where people are. I think most of you are from the North Coast region, which is really nice because you might be able to make some connections today with others looking to do similar work to you. But it's really lovely for us to continue to get more familiar with the traditional custodian nations across the state. All right, so some of you have indicated that you are looking to submit a Skilling Queenslanders for Work application. So you're definitely in the right spot, but the information today really is applicable across tender writing and any submissions that you might be making in the future. So a real cornerstone of Skilling Queenslanders for Work, but many submissions, is partnerships. So it is really useful to meet others in your region who are looking to do similar work. So I do encourage you to introduce yourself. The purpose of today really is to help you put your best case forward to improve your chances of success with your funding applications. And as I have mentioned today, we will be focusing on providing tips for community-based organisations to write tender and grant applications. And the context we're using is Skilling Queenslanders for Work. Now, you may have already submitted a Skilling Queenslanders for Work application, or you might be planning on your first one. But either way, I hope that today's workshop will assist you in preparing and editing your application and making sure it really meets the mark. And these tips and resources will also help you with many other pieces of writing that you do. And these tips have been put together in consultation with the Department of Employment, Small Business and Training, based on their feedback from previous funding rounds for Skilling Queenslanders for Work. And they're also based on our own experience of reviewing and preparing funding applications across the sector. Now, when we talked to the department about Skilling Queenslanders for Work, they did say that they often receive applications that have really great project ideas, but the application itself isn't quite written correctly, or the benefits of the program isn't clear, or there's some common mistakes or omissions that come up quite a bit. So today we're really going to look at tackling those, making sure that those common mistakes are ones that you avoid. The outline of the session today, I'll do a very brief background to Skilling Queenslanders for Work. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but if you do have any questions, I'm sure Lisa is happy to answer them. We're going to look at a methodology for applying for funding, so how we can be really structured in the way that we consider our responses to applications. We're going to look at crafting responses to the assessment criteria using the SKU assessment criteria as our example. And at the end of the session, we're going to spend a small amount of time understanding our obligations regarding the Human Rights Act and child safe principles. Okay, so what is Skilling Queenslanders for Work? It's an ongoing annual investment of $80 million to support up to 15,000 Queenslanders into work each year. And this initiative represents a commitment to increasing workforce participation, driving job growth, and strengthening the performance of the Queensland economy by improving skills and development and work opportunities for Queenslanders who have not been engaging in the workforce or are perhaps underemployed. So SKEW has been around for quite a while, but the workforce landscape is looking a little different. And look, even the past week has provided possibly some either opportunities or disruptions to plans that you might have been thinking about. So there's lots to consider this year as far as Skilling Queenslanders for Work goes. We've got not only an ongoing pandemic to consider in the way we design projects and how we're going to deliver them, but now natural disaster, depending on where you are in a state. So there's lots of different things for us to think about when we're crafting these tender responses. Now, Skilling Queenslanders for Work supports the delivery of really tailored local community-based support to young people, mature age job seekers, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, people with disability, women re-entering the workforce, Australian Defence Force veterans, recently released prisoners, and people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So a lot of variety in the cohorts being targeted here. Now, there are clearly defined target groups for Skilling Queenslanders Work. It's also characterised by voluntary participation. That's a really important element as far as engagement goes. Individual pathways, it's very person-centred, which I know the community services sector is really good at. That's really the core of what we're good at, isn't it? An integrated mix of assistance, so lots of wraparound support, and as I have mentioned, partnerships is a cornerstone of Skilling Queenslanders for Work. So really not only wraparound support that our organisations can provide, but what partnerships we can leverage from to provide more assistance and strong support for participants. So the initiative is supported by a statewide regional network, working closely and forming partnerships with community-based organisations and local employers to determine local skills and entry-level industry and labour needs. So the program relies heavily on the partnerships formed within communities to make sure that participants have a strong pathway to employment. There are 8 programs that make up Skilling Queenslanders for Work. And look, I won't go into much detail about them, but there's heaps of information on the DESBT website, including fact sheets for each of the different programs. And I will show you some of those in this session. So how many of you have submitted a SKEW application before? Yes, Jason has. For anyone who has submitted before, was there a key learning that you had that you'd like to share? Okay, Carolyn and Jason, anything in particular that you learned from the process that you'd tell someone who hasn't submitted one before? Jason has said what comes up in most sessions. Jason says, get your letters of support or MOUs organised early. Yes. Yep, keep your responses simple rather than flowery. Very good advice. Yes, we've got a strict word count here to stick to. We can't waste our words at all. Read and answer the criteria, yes. So we need to, every word counts when there's word restrictions. So we need to make sure that every word goes towards answering the assessment criteria and isn't wasted on things that they haven't actually asked us. Really important. Partnerships are super critical and beneficial to nearly all of the work that we do, but they are incredibly time consuming if we're going to set them up well. And we want to set them up well because we want them to work well. There's nothing that sours a project as much as a partnership that goes bad, particularly if we're in small communities. You know, there's definitely not as big a pool of people to partner with. So we don't want any of those relationships, you know, being soured through a bad experience. So setting up those partnerships and relationships is critical, but it's time consuming. So we need to get those organised and start working on them sooner rather than later. And the good thing about Skilling Queenslanders for Work is that we know there's another funding round. So even if we get started now and we're not submitting this funding round, we know that we can work on those relationships for the next few months and submit another one later. So Jason said he would add, please ensure your partners are going to deliver what is actually agreed upon, particularly if it's in-kind elements with a dollar value on them. That's really important, and we'll talk about ensuring you include in-kind commitments in letters of support and also in your budget. Really important. Thanks, Jason and Caroline, really good input there. So what is the department looking for in funding responses? This is the the crux of any tender response we write, isn't it? We're looking to respond directly to what the funder is looking for. So we're using Skilling Queenslanders for Work as our example. What is the Department of Employment, Small Business and Training looking for in a funding response? Okay, so to sum it up, excuse me, they're looking for community-based organisations who approach projects with the intent to provide genuine support and assistance to participants. So this means organisations who understand their target cohort and their barriers to employment and who can provide support to help them develop the skills they need to gain employment in their local regions. This requires a lot of support and a lot of thought, particularly given things like adapting delivery because of COVID or things like that. It's really important to reiterate, and I'll say this several times during the session because it's really important that we understand this, is that success for Skilling Queenslanders for Work is two-pronged. It is not just about pushing people through a qualification or a skill set. It is about long-term employment. It takes both of those things to be successful or to meet the KPIs for this funding. So if we're considering all the myriad of reasons why individuals are not currently engaged in the workforce, there's lots of things for us to unpack there as community-based organisations to not only support their learning, but to get them into employment and make sure it's long-term employment, make sure they're able to really stick at it and they're supported and we find employers that are going to work with them and all of those things. So genuine support for participants so you can see them through to success. The intent of the Skilling Queenslanders for Work programs is really important for you to be clear on. Any tender application that you're writing, you really have to know very well what the intent of the program is that you're responding to. So the intent of the Skilling Queenslanders for Work programs are developing the skills of disadvantaged Queenslanders, that is people who are underutilised or underemployed in the labour market, as well as building the skills of people in the target groups. You're providing assistance to individuals who need support to enter and stay in the workforce, training and assessment strategies that support the needs of disadvantaged learners. Community-based organisations must have legitimate and established employer engagement strategies in place. And one really clear point to make here is that training for training's sake isn't acceptable. So the project must be driven by the community-based organisation based on their understanding of the cohort and not driven by the RTO. This isn't a training program. It's a training and employment program. So what is the department looking for in your application itself? They're looking for evidence that you understand your cohort or the clients in your community, that you understand their specific barriers and what resources they might need to overcome them, that you can provide the assistance they need to gain employment, that you know where and how you can recruit participants. That's a really important one. Sometimes we have fantastic ideas about what might be good in our region, but then we might actually struggle to get people in the door to participate in our program. So making sure that you actually have a plan for how you're going to get people into the program itself. And that you have links to employers who can provide jobs in your local community. Providing all of this evidence is really crucial for any grant or funding application. So now we're going to look at our methodology. for winning tenders. And this one really can be applied broadly across applications. Following this kind of scaffolding for your tender writing will really assist you to prepare well for the writing itself and make sure you're not spending too much time on that editing and cutting out and realizing that you don't actually have the information you needed, and actually that information that you need is going to take 2 weeks for you to get. All those kinds of issues that we run into when we don't adequately plan for a piece of writing. So you'll notice as I go through this, there's a lot of work to be done before you actually sit down and write anything. And I'll go through that now. So this is a overview of it. And as I said, there is all of this here, all this yellow and orange work to be done before we even get to the writing itself, which is here in blue. So lots of preparation time. And look, I this reminds me of doing assessments. If you've gone through a uni course, even though I internally resisted it a lot, the truth is that I know whenever I did outlines for my assignments and it had some kind of scaffolding for what I was going to write, it always turned out better than if I just went into it writing without having any kind of planning before my writing first. So even though the inclination or our natural response to this is just to, especially if we've got an exciting idea, we just want to get in there and start writing about it. But I absolutely do stand behind the opinion that this kind of scaffolding and planning before you're writing does make it turn out much better and much more balanced, as we'll see as we go through this. Because by the time you get to step 6, which is actually writing the response, you have a really clear idea about what you're including in your proposal, and the writing part is quite easy then if you get to that part. Okay, so the first part of this methodology is to create a grants reference library to map out your project idea and foster strong working relationships. So we're doing some project planning right at the beginning, but simultaneously we need to be thinking about those relationships because they take some time. So we're thinking about those early on in the process. So have you ever found yourself scrambling for information like your financial statements or insurance details 5 minutes before the tender is due to close? I have definitely had some panicky moments where the due date or due time, which is for Skilling Queenslanders work, 5 p.m. on the 31st of March. You need to mark that down in your calendar if you're looking to apply. I've certainly had the experience of needing something pretty urgently on the day that it's due and not knowing where it is. So our suggestion here is to create a grants reference library. So it's one point of truth and a location where all of those general things that you will need for grant writing are available to you. So we have a few ideas here of things that you could keep in this grants reference library. So things like audited financial statements, which you will need for Skilling Queenslanders work, at least 2 years. Your insurance details, ABN. You might have not-for-profit status that you need to evidence. Most applications these days, or most tenders or funding these days, do require resumes or at least a summary of the skills of key staff or personnel who will be working on the project. You might have in there a brief description of your organisation, which when you go to write a description of your organisation, particularly if you do lots of different bits and pieces of work, which lots of community organisations do, they have this program, that program, it might not sound like a big deal to write a summary of your organisation, but it actually is hard to do a succinct summary of your organisation. But most organisations have one. If they have a website, might have it on there. So it's a good idea to have at least an agreed description of your organisation, the work that you do, kept somewhere readily available. Up-to-date information of your organisation's success and capability, including evaluations and positive feedback. And you might even keep in there past grant applications with feedback that you got from them. So and you might even be able to think of some more things that would be suitable to be keeping in a grants reference library. but it will save you the pain of scrambling for something that's critical on the day that it's due, particularly something that you're relying on someone else to supply. So perfect example this week is people suddenly having to tend to personal priorities rather than going to work, which is totally understandable. But imagine that person's your accountant or your finance officer, or some other person that's critical to you finding a piece of documentation or something for submitting your tender. So that's something to keep in mind, is making sure you've got all of those documents readily available, not just for you, but for anyone in the organisation who's working on this kind of thing. Okay, so next is mapping out your project idea. And we've got a handy grant on a page resource with some prompters on how to map out your project idea, which we will pop in the chat now. And it will also be in the post-event email. Now, this resource is designed to help you analyze and design your project model. So when it comes to writing the application itself, you've got a really clear idea of what you're including in it and what the different aspects of your project actually look like. Here it is. This is what it looks like. Now, this is particularly useful if you are working in partnership with people, because you can sit around a table and actually go through all of these aspects and make sure you're on the same page. Because quite often we will visualize something because we have a really clear idea in our own head about what something might look and feel like. But others have not envisioned it in the same way. So this is a really good way of not only you getting clear about your project idea and thinking about all the facets you're going to have to talk about in your tender, but making sure the other people working on the project idea with you has the same vision or as close to yours as possible, so that you're all on the same page. That's one way we can make sure those partnerships keep on track. It's really important to consider when you're looking at funding, whether or not it fits with your organisation's mission. If it's not a good fit, you may not be the best organisation to deliver the project, which is a tricky call to make sometimes, because sometimes we are really desperate for funding, or we've got a really exciting idea and we would like to fund it, but it's critical that we make sure we're applying for funding that fits well with our organisation. This is a tip from one of the department's Skilling Queenslanders for Work assessors, and they say, think about who you work with on a daily basis and develop projects to support your own clients. You know your core business really well, and I'm sure you do a very good job of it. So leverage from what you already know, the cohorts you work well with, the organisations you already partner with to support clients or service users that come through your door. Leverage from what you know, because you do it well. So here are some of the key elements you're going to be thinking about while you're in that planning phase. And if someone reading your application can answer these questions after reading through your application, then you're on the right track. These are the things that should be very clear in your project summary and in your application. So I do recommend, after we get off the line, if you have some time, you might like to use that grant up on a page resource and start mapping out your project idea. If you've got some colleagues in the office today and you're with them, you might like to sit down and start mapping it out as soon as we're done this morning. And we've only got, how many days until, we've only got a couple of weeks until this funding round closes. So definitely time to get our skates on if we haven't got that project, all the facets of that project teased out yet. Okay, so while we're doing all of this planning, really important to start building strong working relationships. And as Jason and Carolyn have said earlier, the sooner you can get onto that, the better. So the time to form partnerships is absolutely not at the last minute when you need a letter of support to finish your funding application. And if you're not familiar with what a letter of support is, we will talk about them in a little bit. If funding opportunities come up, you need to be ready to go. So I know in the community services sector, you work in partnership with many organisations as it is, and you do that work well. So you may not have to start from scratch as far as building relationships, but being clear about, as Jason said, what each partner is expected to bring to the table, making sure that's actually documented, and everyone being clear about what the vision for the project is very important. Now, I will say here too that another very important relationship in respect to Skilling Queenslanders for Work is department, is DESBIT. So I strongly encourage you, and I know Lisa will agree, to get in contact with your regional office to discuss your project idea well before you're submitting. You should be contacting them right now at the right at the beginning of your thinking process to discuss the idea that you have. So they know about the local priorities and whether or not your project is likely to be successful, likely to address the priorities they have for the region. And they'll be able to give you some advice about whether or not it really meets the program guidelines, because we don't want you spending lots of energy or resources writing up an application that's unlikely to be successful. So really consider your relationship with DESBIT as an important element to this whole process. I strongly recommend that you get in touch with them, but they also would like you to have a chat to them before you're putting anything together. In fact, I think the preference would be, Lisa, that they're not seeing any applications coming in from an organisation and being surprised by the name on the application. They want to know all the ones that are coming through. They've already heard from them and had a chat to them about their idea.
That's right. We don't like surprises. Yeah, it's not Christmas, so we'd like to know and have a talk to you, just like I did a thumbs up before, like Stacey said. Yep.
Thanks, Lisa. Yep. So if you haven't had a chat to Lisa or someone from her team, give them a call. And the other relationship you need to be working on is the one with your RTO. So you need to have to evidence in your application what that relationship looks like. And it's an important one because the training or education aspect of your program is going to be a critical part of success for your participants. So making sure that you and your RTO are on the same page as far as how you're going to work with your cohort, what supports you might have in place, and what that delivery actually looks like. Okay, so we're moving into the second band of this methodology, which is matching project to a grant or program, which if you're applying for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, you've already done that, and creating a team and a timeline. So as I said, it's likely that you've identified Skilling Queenslanders for Work as your funding opportunity if you've come along today, but here's some additional sources for finding grants. It's also worth talking to partners and other organisations that you work with so they can give you some first-hand experience. There are some reliable funding grants that a lot of community organisations apply for regularly. So having a chat to how others are resourcing projects is a good idea. And as I had said before, as tempting as it can be to, when you see a funding opportunity come up and you just want to be able to gain that funding, don't waste time applying for a grant if your project doesn't fit the criteria of your organisation, doesn't really fit the vision for the funding itself. You need to find grants that match the work that your organisation does and the ideas that you have, not ideas just to match a grant. And if you keep some people might like to keep ideas of things their organisation would do well in that grants reference library, so that you've already got a bit of a idea mapped out for particular things, so that when funding comes up that suits it, some of the thinking's already done. Now, if you're applying for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, remember that there are 8 programs to choose from. So talk to the DESBIT office about your project, and they will be able to clarify which kind of direction you're needing to go in, what might be most appropriate for you in the project idea that you have. Now, if you have found funding that you think matches well with your organisation's direction, it's time to decide if you meet the requirements of the funder. So the first step is to assess what those requirements are. This is really important because it's key to knowing whether or not you want to proceed with your proposal and if you'll meet the criteria. And of course, you're going to need to demonstrate in your submission that you can meet those program requirements. So with all the information you've gathered, it's time to make a go or no-go decision. And this is where you need to make really strategic decisions about whether or not you go ahead with applying for funding. Are you eligible, and does it align with your strategic goals and values or not? Sometimes it won't. And while it can be frustrating, it's really a waste of your time to put together a proposal that doesn't meet those requirements. Sometimes you'll find that the outcomes of your project idea are only slightly different from the outcomes being sought by the funder. And in those cases, you might want to go ahead. You might be happy to tweak some of your project outcomes to fit the funding that's available. That's a decision that only your organisation and your governing body can really decide on. But again, it's always good to run any ideas past the funder to save yourself time and disappointment later. And finally, a really good question to ask yourself is, do you have enough time to apply for this funding? You might be better off leaving it to the future funding round if you know that there's another one coming, so that you have enough time to put together a really good application rather than one that's very rushed. And if you are looking for SKU team contact details, they are here. You can find all the regional office contact details on the DESBET website. Okay, so making sure you're reading the funding guidelines well before you start the application. For Skilling Queenslanders for Work, for example, the guidelines for each program contain information on the objectives of the program, eligibility criteria, expected outcomes and KPIs, which I think is a really useful aspect on the fact sheets available, how applications will be assessed and the assessment criteria. And it can be overwhelming to go through all that information right at the beginning, particularly if you're pushed for time, but there's no shortcut. It's the only way really to get a clear and full picture of what's required from you. And everything in there makes it very clear about what you need to comply with and how to prepare a successful application. So for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, applications are only going to be accepted via the application portal. So make sure you're registered and familiar with what's in the portal well before the deadline. Don't leave it to the last minute and find that you don't have what's required for your submission. There are other resources that are available on the SKU website, such as the user support guide and frequently asked questions. They're really useful, so I do recommend checking them out. Okay, so this goes back to starting early. This is a snapshot of some of the data gained from our Grants in Australia report. Now, this table shows us that 54% of these respondents said that they had started an application, but they didn't end up submitting it, which is a fair, that's a fair amount. Now, 38% said it was because they ran out of time to complete the application form. So that's something we're absolutely wanting to avoid in this process. The survey also found that 27% dropped out partway through filling out the application when they realised the program wasn't right for them, and 16% dropped out after discovering they didn't meet the eligibility requirements. So reading those funding guidelines early will save us from even putting pen to paper or starting our online application when we're not actually eligible for funding. And considering whether or not it's best to apply for this funding or wait for the next round will assist us in hopefully not having to abandon a application partway through because we run out of time. Okay, so the next step here is creating a team and a timeline. So once you've decided you're going ahead with your tender response, it's really important to think about who is actually going to be contributing to this process and what their roles and responsibilities are. Now, some of you might be from very small organisations. I totally understand that. And you might be saying in your head right now, oh, well, I'm going to be working on this by myself. There's not really anyone else involved. But even if someone else isn't writing the application, it's likely that there's some others involved. For example, does your chair need to approve applications before you submit them? Who has the financial statements? Do you have a finance officer that needs to generate those for you or give them to you? Who's working on the partnership aspect of it? So are you the person going out getting letters of support from organisations and employers, or is someone else in your team working on that? So look, even if you are from a very small organisation, it's important to consider who else might actually have a hand in this process. So, as I mentioned, there might be a chair that needs to sign something or approve something. You might have someone you've thought would be a good person to read through the application before you submit, a person who's good with proofreading, who will pick up on small mistakes that you might gloss over. And it's a good idea to use that grant on a page resource to have a kick-off meeting around. Assess the requirements again as a team, make sure you haven't missed anything, and ensure that everyone is aware of the requirements. You can start to assign roles. So think in detail about all the tasks associated with writing this tender, and then you can develop a timeline. So working backwards from the due date. So for this time around, it's the 31st of March. So we know that's the end date. Working backwards, how long do we think each of these tasks are going to take? Who's doing each one? What's their due date for the part that they're doing? If a person is writing the tender application, when are we agreeing that they're going to have it finished in time for the person who's proofreading it, so that they have adequate time to do that before it's submitted? Or when do the letters of support need to be in, so that we can look over them and make sure they're okay and there's enough wriggle room to edit or rewrite them with the partner if they're not quite right. So all of those tasks, and marking out time in your calendar to make sure you do have adequate time set aside to do those things. Okay, I did want to say one thing about this actually. If people aren't aware that they're actually involved in this process, for example, your IT officer is taking leave, or the chair of your committee is actually going to be away for the time that they need to be approving things. It can be very frustrating to realise that person's away or not even going to be in that week at all when a submission is due. So by allocating these tasks and making sure every person is aware of their involvement, even if it's a very small involvement, a quick task, that avoids the frustration of them maybe having to do something while they're on leave or answer an email when they're not actually meant to be in the office, all of those kinds of things. It's really about communication, isn't it? Making sure everyone's aware of what they're offering in the process. Okay, so a key part of the planning process really is to read those guidelines for funding, as we've already mentioned, and to assess the requirements in there. Now, this is a screenshot of the guide to applying for funding for Skilling Queenslanders work, which I think is a really good document. It's very clear, and it has all of the assessment criteria really clearly laid out there, with beside each one what evidence you need to supply next to that criteria. So it makes it really clear what you as an organisation need to be gathering to put forward a good application. And it's useful to use a tender planning checklist to capture all of those things. So on the back page of the grant on a page resource, you will notice that there is a pretty comprehensive checklist. When you're going through the guide to funding, or whatever guidelines sit alongside the funding that you're applying for, capture all the things in that checklist that you need to gather for your application. So pieces of evidence that it's asking you to supply, who's doing what, all the things that you need to include in the application. Now, how you are going to evaluate your project is a really important part of this planning process. So make sure it's not an afterthought. Think about how you're going to measure success and how you'll know if your project is meeting your goals. And as you're writing your application, think about whether or not you can deliver what you say you will and how you're going to measure that. So generally, what you write in your application becomes part of your KPIs, or what your funder is going to end up expecting from you. So make sure you're realistic and you're not overpromising what you can do. It also pays to think about whether or not you need to build evaluation into your budget. So that it might not be the case to Skilling Queenslanders for work. Not saying that this project specifically will require a lot of resourcing to the evaluation, but in that Grants in Australia survey that I referenced earlier with the applications, 20% of those respondents said that they wished they had built evaluation into the budget because they didn't think about it adequately. And when it came time to evaluate, it actually took a lot more resourcing than what they had anticipated. And the thing about evaluation is that it gives you a good set of data for future projects and funding. So it's absolutely not something we want to skimp on. We want to make sure we, well, for several reasons, we want to make sure that what we think is a good methodology or project really is. We want to evaluate it to make sure that our opinion of the work that we're doing is correct. But it also gives us really good data to use in future applications. All right, we're getting there. So this is where we're starting. We've done all that good planning and we get down to the actual process of writing the application. So we talked about the importance of developing clarity around your project, using that grant on a page resource to guide your work and establishing a project team and timeline. And now we're diving into developing a structure for your responses. And it's really important to plan your approach to the assessment or selection criteria and getting clarity first before you write. And that's one very key message from this workshop is to think before you write. Now, a key part of this planning and thinking is determining the structure of your response. So think of it as a scaffold on which your fuller response will be built. As we've said, there's a strict word count, so every word matters, particularly if you are working to any kind of character or word count, which is the case with Skilling Queenslanders for work. So writing your application as though the person reading it knows nothing about your organisational project and never assume anything about what the reader knows. Now, the first point I'm going to make here is that you're not writing a novel. So I'm not talking about the length here or the fact that you can't get creative. I'm talking about the fact that the structure is fundamentally different. So creative writing tends to introduce details like characters and scenes, and we're left intrigued and wondering what's going to happen next and how did this character get here. And as we read further, we start to learn some of the answers and a plot starts to develop. And there's twists and there's mystery. And all kinds of things before we get a resolution at the end. So what we're looking for in our tender response is the exact opposite. There is no room for intrigue and working up to a point. The reader wants to be hit with the key points straight away. So you need to start with the key message in each paragraph, and then you're providing your supporting points and themes and data and evidence. Now, by putting examples and evidence down the bottom, I absolutely don't mean to say it's less important. It's simply that you need to start with the key message. So when we're structuring our responses, we want to decide what the key message will be first. So it's a good idea to do some brainstorming with your colleagues or other partners for this purpose before you actually get down to writing all the detail. So sometimes we see responses that build up to the point and often use lots and lots of examples. And sometimes that is making up for the fact that the examples aren't particularly good ones. We don't want to use 50 different examples of work that we've done. The funder would prefer to hear an example of 1 or 2 times that you actually showed that you have capability in this particular kind of program management and delivery. And again, evaluating your projects thoroughly will give you a good set of data for future projects and funding and some really good examples to use. So we use SKU as an example. If you're trying to structure a response for the assessment criteria, servicing community and industry needs, which is one of them, you need to highlight, so you might highlight, like I've done here, the key areas that you need to address in this criteria. So in this example, you need to demonstrate that you understand the skills and labour needs at the local community level and how your project will address these. That's where you need to provide evidence of local industry demand and benefit, to identify local skill shortages and future employment opportunities. So this is a really, the funder is laying out here very clearly what they want to hear from you. There's no mystery here about what they're asking. So it's really important that we respond specifically to what's being asked here. In the next slide, I will show you an example of how you may structure your response specifically to address this selection criteria. See, I've noted here that there's a maximum character count for this response. So really just reiterating here that every word counts, and making sure that you put some scaffolding around your response will mean that you can provide a balanced answer, not spend you know, 1,800 characters on one of the things they've asked in that selection criteria, and only having 1,000 characters left to answer all of the others. So I'll show you now what that might look like. Okay, so here, I find it useful to map it out visually. My feedback from others is that a lot of people find this useful. So you can use bullet points or sub-dot points, but here we are putting out, so these are those highlighted bits from the selection criteria. These are the specific things they're asking for us to evidence. Here up the top, you can see what I've done is allocated, and this is just a suggestion, not at all saying that this is exactly how you will craft your response. But if I know I've only got however many words for a response, dissecting it this way ensures that when I'm writing, I don't spend far too much of my word count on one thing and then leave myself nothing for the others. And that saves you the pain of, you know, you might have had this experience where you spend an hour on a paragraph and making it sound just right, and you've got it, you know, just the way you want it. And then when you get at the end, you've gone over your word count and you have to ruthlessly edit your work. I don't want any of you spending an hour on a particular paragraph or a response and then realizing that you need to cut it out because you went way over your word count and you didn't leave yourself enough words to respond to another aspect of the selection criteria. So let's save yourself that pain and make sure you know right up front how many words you've got to spend on each of these things. So, okay, so thinking about how many words you've got to spend, thinking about what aspect of the selection criteria you're responding to, what your key message is in response to that, and what pieces of evidence you're going to be using for that. Now, the other benefit of structuring this out before you start writing is that it becomes very obvious that when you're missing key pieces of evidence. So you might go, yep, this, you know, our local need is baristas in our community. We've got no one to staff the local cafes for whatever reason, and there's definitely a need for that. But you need to think about how you're actually going to prove that. So what evidence are you using for that? Or you might say that you've had a whole heap of people from a particular cultural group move to your region. What's your evidence for that? This not only helps us identify that there might be gaps in the evidence that we have available, but it also helps us to check our own thinking before we spend too much time writing. Sometimes we might be operating in a bit of a vacuum and we've told ourselves something is true, but we haven't actually checked that it is by checking out the evidence. So I'm talking about the statistical information, checking with other employers, finding out council information, just to check that what we think in our head is actually the case in real life. Hopefully that's clear. Please let me know if there's anything unclear about this structure. I really do think this is probably one of the most useful things that you can do in writing a tender to make sure you have a balanced response and that you're not accidentally skipping any facet of the application. So here's a starting point. Here's an example of how someone might have responded to servicing our community needs. So it says, Superhot has been delivering accredited early childhood education training programs since 2009. This program involved partnership arrangements between childcare centres and registered training organisations. In 2012, we expanded our program to include cultural competency training for working with Aboriginal families, as there is a large population of Aboriginal families in the region. In 2017, we added a new training program specifically targeting migrant and refugee women, as there have been a very significant increase in migrant families in the local community. Trained staff are a requirement of the Early Childhood Education and Care National Regulations, and there is currently a shortage of qualified staff in Utopia. Unemployment and underemployment is significantly higher for Aboriginal and migrant women in the region, so these programs are helping to deliver employment opportunities. There is also a growing number of families moving into the area, so demand for childcare is increasing. Okay, so the The first thing I'll point out here is that there isn't any evidence. So, I mean, it's very difficult for the assessor who's reading this to know if this is accurate. I mean, it might sound compelling, but there's no evidence to back it up. And you might have also picked up on some areas where you could simplify the language. For example, we've got the phrase there in the second paragraph, very significant increase. Okay, so there's some editing we could do to the wording there. So here is a rewrite. This is obviously this is a fictitious response, but it shows you how the mapping might pan out in your written application. So we're using this structure here. This is an example of a response that hasn't really used any structure, but the person's just sat down and started writing. But if we look at someone actually following this process here, this is what it might look like. Obviously, you wouldn't have those words in the brackets there, but for the assessor or person reading it, it becomes very clear that they have actually ticked off every aspect of that selection criteria. They haven't skipped any of it because it's difficult to answer or they haven't done a lot of thinking about it. And there, as you can see in this response, there is evidence provided for the key messages. So you need to say where you got the information and provide the evidence to back up your claims. So they say in this edited version, with a growing population of young families in the Utopia region, there's more demand for childcare and kindergarten places. And then you put local council data there. Trained staff are a requirement of the Early Childhood Education and Care National Regulations, and there is a shortage of qualified staff in Utopia. And again, you've got some evidence, you put your evidence in the brackets. There are 5 childcare services in the town of Paradise, with a new service planned in the next year in the Paradise housing development. It is estimated that there will be demand for 50 more qualified childcare workers over the next 2 years. Okay, so here we're actually putting some quantities to the claims. So the assessor is getting an idea of how big the need it actually is. You know, is the need that you need 5 new educators? Oh no, it's 50. Okay, that's a significant workforce requirement. In the next paragraph, we're writing about the impact on the community. It is important that childcare workers have appropriate cultural competency training to support culturally and linguistically diverse families and encourage greater participation in early childhood education. And there we've got a reference to the Early Years Learning Framework where it makes that claim. There is a large population of COLD communities in the region, including Aboriginal people and migrants. Put in there some ABS data. So providing childcare workers with relevant cultural training is vital. There is also a shortage of workers with relevant language skills. Then we're talking about linking the project to need. Unemployment and underemployment are significantly higher for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander migrant women in the region compared to the regional average. 10 and 12% compared to 5.5%. ABS data. This project will expand on the work we have done over the last 10 years in the community to develop employment opportunities for Aboriginal women and migrant and refugee women while providing qualified and culturally competent staff to meet the shortage of appropriate early childhood educators. Lastly, local support. We will continue to work with local council and Paradise Migrant Women's Centre, they're actually talking about their partner here, to connect with elders and community role models. All 5 local childcare centres have agreed to provide mentors to work one-on-one with trainees and provide work placement opportunities. 10 letters of support from someone are attached, and then you would attach your letters of support. So you can see here, very clear. They have addressed every aspect of that particular selection criteria, and they have provided evidence. Okay. So I'm going to use the Skilling Queenslanders for Work initiative now to go through how we would address the assessment criteria specifically for that. So if you are looking to submit an application for this funding, you'll probably find this aspect quite useful. Okay, so in any tender development process, responding to the assessment criteria is really the biggest part of your writing effort. And your answers will only be as good as the thinking you have done during your preparation. They are your opportunity to demonstrate you understand the requirements, to provide evidence, to demonstrate your capacity to deliver, demonstrate value for money, and to articulate your unique value proposition. The assessment or selection criteria responses you give really should reflect what's most important to the funder. These criteria will be used to score and rank your proposal in relation to others. So you should be aware that sometimes different people may assess different criteria. This means that it's not always a good idea to answer criteria by referring to information in another criteria. It may be necessary to repeat some information where it's of importance to addressing the specific criteria. So here are some of our tips for answering the assessment criteria. Be really clear about what's being asked and what needs to be included. A good response will be clear, concise, and comprehensive. And I know being comprehensive while being concise is a little tricky, but I will talk about that more. Plan your key messages and put them up front. And make sure you provide the evidence to back up your claims. Okay, so let's use SKU as our example here. Now, for SKU applications, they're assessed in 2 stages. Now, this is really important for you to be aware of. Stage 1 assessment involves the assessment criteria against capacity to manage. An applicant must demonstrate a capacity to manage in order to be eligible to proceed to Stage 2 assessment. So this includes things like financial viability, governance, experience, and staff with appropriate experience. And I'll go into detail shortly about that. Stage 2 involves assessing eligible applications against the other assessment criteria by the department and locally based Skilling Queenslanders for Work advisory jobs committees comprising of representatives from the community. So if you're not familiar with that process, firstly, DESBT is going to look at your capacity to manage and determine whether or not they think you would be able to deliver what you say you're going to deliver. If you are successful in meeting that requirement, your application will then be assessed by one of these local Skilling Queenslanders for Work advisory jobs committees. And that's made up of people from your region, representatives from the community, industry, government, unions, a whole selection of people. So it's really important to know that if you have just done an absolute stellar job in responding to criteria 2, 3, and 4, but it's not very clear in criteria 1 that your organisation truly does have capacity to manage a project that you're proposing, unfortunately, no one's going to actually be looking at your criteria 2, 3, and 4. So your effort there is very much wasted if you haven't been able to establish capacity to manage right in the first criteria. Really important that you're aware of that. I wouldn't want you to not have it really clear in criteria 1 that you do have capacity to manage, and then all the work that you put into the rest of the application is wasted. Okay, so let's look at criteria 1, capacity to manage. Now, this is a screenshot from that guide to applying for funding, which is on the DESBT website, and we've shared in the chat, and we'll put it in the post-event email. So what's being asked here is around financial viability, your structure, governance, risk management, reporting, what's your relationship with the RTO, and importantly, what relevant experience you have in this area. And you can see down on the right-hand side, they've been really clear about what documentation or evidence is going to be required for this criteria. So here we've got audited income and expenditure statements for the past 2 years. That's a mandatory requirement. Staff resumes or background information or relevant position descriptions. So right from when you're right back at that planning stage, they're the 2 things you're noting. Oh, yep, okay, who's getting those audited income expenditure statements? Do we have the resumes of all the people involved in this, making sure you're getting all those documentation together? So what does the department really want to know? They want to know, can your organisation deliver what you say you're going to deliver? Very important for a funder to know. And this is what the portal will look like. So I mentioned the online portal for submitting tenders for this particular funding. You will see here that there's a bit of a counter here for your characters. As I said, you've got 2,800 characters. Now I estimate that's about 3/4 to 1 full A4 page, or maybe 350 to 400 words. But this app will count down. It will tell you when you've got 200 characters left. It's fine to use bullet points in applications as long as it serves the writing well. You need to address the key points. But if bullet points are going to help you do that without using too many characters, it might be appropriate for you to be using them. And here down the bottom, you can see that there is a place for you to be attaching your audited income and expenditure statements, and your staff resumes. So that's what it'll look like when you go to actually submitting your application. So what's being asked? Financial viability, your structure, what experience you have, all of that kind of thing. And some of this information you will have in your grants reference library, so you can see the benefit of having that information in one handy spot. And what you need to address here is information about your organisation, your track record, your staff experience, and linking back to how you're going to deliver the project. Your chosen participants, this covers a range of different aspects, so including your organisation's experience in dealing with that identified cohort and understanding their barriers to employment. It also includes articulating how you're going to reach and recruit participants and ensure they're eligible for the program. Further in this criteria, you need to include information about the experience of your organisation in delivering or working with an RTO to deliver training or projects outside an institutional setting in a community-based environment. So when you get, as I have said, once you get to the stage, you should be really clear about your answers to this because you've already done lots of thinking about what the project actually looks like. So that shouldn't be too hard for you to address. Okay, so criteria 2, servicing community industry needs. Again, this is a screenshot straight from that guide to applying for funding. There's lots of things here to address, and very handy, again, on the right-hand side, we've got here all the documentation that you're going to be required to attach for this one. So servicing community industry needs. Please note, this is where you're attaching your letters of support from local employers or industry groups, and I will go into the detail of the letters soon. So what's being asked in this criteria? How does your project fit in the local community? What's the community benefit and what's the community need for it? What's the link between the learner group and the skill shortage and labour needs in the local community where you're proposing to deliver the project? So if your organisation is based outside of the delivery area, you're going to have to really thoroughly address the community and industry links in the delivery location that you have. Make sure you have very clearly articulated what those links are. So what you need to address here is basically that you know your community, that you know who needs work, you know that there's an industry in your community that suits them, and that this will fill a labour shortage. You also need to show your links to employers in the community. Now, another thing to address here is how the project might link with other local initiatives or services. So Skilling Queenslanders for Work is one of those funding opportunities that's great to leverage from other things that are happening in your community. And I'm sure you'll be quite familiar with some of the projects happening, particularly if you're in a smaller or more regional community. And thinking about how Skilling Queenslanders for Work could dovetail with or add value to things that are happening already. So here's some detail about criteria 3. And again, this is directly from the funding guide. Essentially, Skilling Queenslanders for Work is an initiative targeting those who have had some barriers to gaining employment. And there are many reasons that some will struggle to find work. And this criteria here, this is your opportunity to show the funder that you understand the barriers specific to the group that you're targeting and that you have plans for how you're going to support those participants. So think about organisations and services in your community and who could assist you to support participants and whether or not you need to find out more about their specific challenges. Childcare, language, transport to and from the location of training, cultural safety, lots of things to think about here. And again, this is what it's going to look like when you're submitting it. So here you need to provide a template of training and support plan. So that's your organisation's plan. That's not just what the RTO is going to be doing, because RTOs will have written up a training plan. This is about the wraparound support that your participants will receive. And this really highlights the benefit of going through the application early on. So you will see that all these different things that you need to be putting together, it's not as simple as just throwing some words together on the day. There's lots of different supplementary attachments you need to have prepared to submit a Skilling Queenslanders for Work application. Okay, so this is where you can refer to your grant on a page template, because you've already done a lot of thinking about what kind of support is going to be given to participants. It might include things like providing career advice, job preparation skills, communication skills, mentoring, mental health support, individual case management, lots of different things that can be used to support participants in their journey to long-term employment. And I do recommend, if you haven't watched it or haven't participated in it, if you watch the Introduction to Skilling Queenslanders for Work webinar, there are some great examples of real-life projects that have happened through Skilling Queenslanders for Work, and it lays out what kinds of support those participants were given. So if you are doing this for the first time, or you're fairly new to the game, I would recommend looking at those project examples, because they will give you some great ideas about the kinds of support that you as an organisation would be able to provide participants. So talk about how you're going to provide job placement and post-placement support, and what your transition to the employment really looks like here. So training delivery strategies need to be flexible and adequate to meet the needs of your target participants. Ensure that your support services are appropriate for your target cohort. Ensure that appropriate time is allowed for learners with a disadvantage to complete their qualification. And taking into consideration the target group and the level of the qualification that's being delivered. And make sure, again, that you your support plan spells out the tailored support your organisation will be providing, in addition to the training by the partner RTO. Is the RTO on board? Do they have ideas about how to best support individuals? This partnership and your contributions, as well as the RTO's contributions, will make a big difference to the success of your project. Okay, so here we've got the fourth criteria is your outcomes. In this section, the funder is establishing confidence in the value of funding your project. So what will be the outcomes of it? Outcomes will vary according to the specific program you're applying for. So the department's expectations about the outcomes to be achieved for each program are published on their website in the program guidelines. And again, this is where it pays to have done your homework up front. Make sure you've read the guidelines and you have your checklist, and you know that you are putting forward a project idea that does actually pitch KPIs that match what the funder is expecting. So I'll show you an example here. I find these fact sheets are really clear, really good from Desbert. So I've zoomed in and highlighted here something from the back page of this specific community work skills guidelines for funding. So community work skills is one of the 8 programs available. And on the back page, what outcomes are expected is on all of the guidelines. So whichever one you're applying for, you will be able to find the guidelines specifically for the program you're looking at. It says here the KPIs, completion outcome, 65% of participants successfully gain the required outcome of qualification or statement of attainment. And the employment expectation is that 55% of participants successfully gain employment. So again, we're thinking realistically about our goals and what we can deliver here. We need to ensure that we, at the minimum, can meet the KPIs expected by our funder. And this reiterates again that success in the context of Skilling Queenslanders for Work is two-pronged. It is about completion outcome, training or skills, and it is about employment. Both of those things need to be achieved. So for this criteria, it really comes down to the key objectives of the program and how you're going to actually get your participants a job at the end of the program. This is about showing that you know the local community where you're delivering the project, you know the qualifications and the skills needed, and that your project idea really will address those things. This is where you need to provide evidence that local employers know your organisation and support your project, and if possible would employ your participants. So make sure that letters of support from employers are current and relevant to your project. So put in any examples of past performance and outcomes achieved, either for SKU or for projects that are comparable. And you can see here why it's so important to properly evaluate any work that you do. It's all part of the evidence for future funding. Now, when we spoke to a community representative from the Skilling Queenslander for Work Advisory Jobs Committee, they all said that it was important that applicants talk about their connection to the community and to local employers. That's a really important part of your application. Oh, I don't know what happened there. Okay, so this final criteria that you're looking at, costs and value for money. So what will it cost and what will be provided in kind? Now, DESBET does have nominal benchmarks for costs, but best value does not mean the cheapest. You do, however, have to address how you came up with these costs, and you need to justify how these costs will help participants overcome any of the barriers to get a job. It's really important to outline how much in-kind contribution is included and what it entails. And you need to think about what your organisation is providing and very clearly articulate any in-kind support. Examples of this may include things like a training room, learning resources, catering, transport, etc. Put in the rationale about how you came up with your cost estimates. It's really important. Now, these tips apply to all of your tender writing projects. Be realistic when you're setting a budget. It will not serve you as an organisation well to be successful in obtaining funding with a budget that was not realistic, because at the end of the day, you're going to be shortchanged really by yourself. So we need to be competitive, but we need to be realistic when we're putting together costs. If your costs are on the higher side, make sure you explain why in your application. For example, if you're delivering in a remote area, transport costs might be higher. Talk about that. Put in detail in your budget. Ensure that you include all in-kind support in your application, and whether it's financial or otherwise. And make sure you read the guidelines to see what costs are allowed in the funding. And really importantly, think about how you're going to acquit your grant and how you're going to demonstrate that the amount of time and effort that you budgeted for in kind has actually been contributed. And that, look, I want to go back to what Jason said about making sure your partners are actually understand that what they've agreed to supply in kind needs to happen too. So, you know, how solid are those partnerships, and how have you documented what they're actually going to be providing in kind? Really important that everyone's very clear on that. Now, here are 5 top budgeting tips for Skilling Queenslanders for Work. So check your costs are eligible. This is a really common mistake, but one that's easy to avoid. The guide to applying for funding, which is on the DESBET website, makes it really clear. For example, you can't include office furniture or motor vehicles, but you can include support costs like subsidised travel or meal programs or things like that. So the department has identified some confusion from a number of SKU providers regarding funding for post-participation support. So I want to make that really clear here, that Skilling Queenslanders for Work funds are only able to be expended on eligible activities up until the delivery end date. So despite your final report for the project not being due for another 90 days, the support you choose to offer participants in that period is in-kind support from your organisation. So just want to be really clear on that. The SKU funding is only up until your delivery end date. And that's not to say you then cut all ties with your participants, but we just want to be really clear that support you're offering participants after that date is in-kind support. Number 2, staffing costs. Make sure your wage expenses include everything to do with wages. So if there's an award increase scheduled for during your project, make sure you include that. Superannuation, that's one that sometimes gets missed. And if your budget needs to include work cover costs, check your insurance policy to ensure you're budgeting the right amount for each trainee. So if you're submitting an application for work skills traineeships and you need to claim for work cover expenses, make sure you're including a really accurate figure. So the assessors are familiar with what's an average percentage to be claiming for in this kind of expense. So they have seen some applications come through that have some pretty wild guesstimates as far as what they're claiming for work cover expenses. So guesses that are outside of the normal bracket of what normal is considered, they are pretty obvious and it won't look very professional. And what happens to an assessor when they're looking at a budget like this, if they can see that there's been guesstimates in particular aspects of your budget, it starts to make them feel uncertain about the other costs that you've included, and we don't want them feeling uncertain about our budget. So being really accurate and taking the time to actually check things like insurance policies is really important. Now, number 3 is spending locally. Is there someone you could be partnering with locally to cut down on travel costs? Those assessing applications, they will look favourably on submissions which utilise local partnerships. Look, sometimes it is easier to have a partnership with bigger organisations or businesses, particularly when they approach you, and that saves you the work of having to go and approach others yourself. But in the long run, this initiative, Skilling Queenslanders work, is really looking to grow local partnerships and support participants long-term in their communities. So not only do you cut travel costs by using local suppliers and trainers, but you contribute to that long-term goal of forming community-based partnerships. Some travel is ineligible also, so you need to be careful of that. So interstate travel, things like that, you can't claim for that. So partnering locally is definitely the preference for this work. Now, number 4, include detail. So detailed budgets mean you don't get caught out claiming for something that's not an eligible expense. And it makes it so much easier for financial reconciliation. So those assessing your application will feel confident that they know what exactly they're funding, which is a big positive for you. Detailed budgets also make things much easier if you have things like expected or unexpected staff turnover during your project. It's really hard to come in mid-project and there's a very vague budget and you're not quite sure what's included in it, and whether or not you're going to be cutting yourself short at the end because you're not sure whether or not particular aspects of the program you're delivering are actually covered. So being super detailed in your budget means that there's not much guesswork there, and it means acquitting things at the end is much easier. And make sure it adds up. So get someone else to run through the numbers. We always recommend that someone proofreads your writing, and the same really applies for your budget. It's really common how this mistake is, where the total at the end of the budget doesn't actually add up right. So making sure that someone else goes through them, adds it up, make sure it's right is really important. So generally speaking, some common pitfalls for Skilling Queenslanders work. Not addressing the assessment criteria. Remember, the assessment criteria are the key things your funder wants to know about your project that you're putting forward. Waffling on about something else that you would like to say but isn't actually in the assessment criteria is a waste of your words. So make sure you're addressing the assessment criteria and making sure you're addressing every aspect of the assessment criteria, which you will do if you scaffold your response and ensure that you are spending a balanced amount of words on each of those aspects. A really clear project summary that sums up what you're wanting to do, and the assessor can get a quick idea of what you're actually talking about and what your project idea really is in essence. The next pitfall is not demonstrating local knowledge and understanding of your cohort. So as local community ownership is a cornerstone of the SKU program, it's really important that you address this throughout your application. You must demonstrate that you understand your target cohort and their barriers to success, and provide the evidence that you have experience and the capacity to support them. Now, mistakes due to cutting and pasting. This is a painful one. You might think that it will save you a lot of time cutting and pasting from a previous application, but often the editing that's required to make it properly fit, it takes just as much time in the long run. So I am absolutely not saying not to utilise past applications, because I think it's clever if you've already done some good thinking and it's a similar or the same application to be utilising the words you've already put together, but write it fresh. So refer to it, but write it fresh, not copying and pasting information into the new application. And of course, as we've just spoken about, a budget with little detail or incorrect numbers. So as you're crafting your response to the assessment criteria, you need to be thinking about what evidence you can provide to support your application. We've already spoken about this, and if we're scaffolding our responses with that structure that we laid out, we're already thinking about what pieces of evidence we're going to be using for each key message that we're putting forward. So we've talked about having information in our grants reference library, and we also need to be thinking about things like letters of support, and I'll go into that now. So make sure you provide evidence from local employers that they support the project that you're proposing, not just support for your organisation. This again is a common mistake. So you must be able to show a link between the training and skills development and local employment outcomes. Make sure they're relevant to the training in your proposal and that they demonstrate industry demand for the qualifications identified, and that they link to employment opportunities in your region and that they're current. It does not need to be a commitment from employers that they absolutely 100% will provide jobs. Even though that would be fantastic, that's not realistic. Employers, and particularly small businesses and smaller employers, aren't going to be signing on a dotted line saying that they will definitely employ someone from your program. But what we do need is evidence that there is local support from employers and industry in your region, that this qualification that you're intending to deliver is definitely needed. And if they're in the position to, they would be likely to employ someone with those skills at the end of this program. Now, so I'll go into this idea that it needs to be support for your project and not just your organisation now, because this is a really important distinction to make. If I'm putting together a Skilling Queenslanders for Work application and I get my letters of support, and they say, you know, let's go down that barista idea again. Say I'm putting together a project idea to train 10 people in my community up to be baristas because I've identified that there's a shortage in my community. And I get a letter of support from Joe's Cafe down the road. And the letter of support says, I really support QCOS, my organisation. They're a great organisation, have always enjoyed working with them. I support what they do, and something else nice about our organisation. The staff are always really friendly. Okay, that's a lovely letter. Very nice to hear, but it says nothing about the actual project. So the letter must actually reference the project and the qualification that you are looking to provide. So it needs to say, yes, as an employer in this region, we have identified that there is a shortage in people available to work in our cafe with the right qualifications, specifically the one I'm looking to deliver. Should we have should business be continuing as usual at the succession of this program, we would be likely to be looking to employ someone with this qualification, Okay, so you get the idea, is that clear? That's the difference in the letter of support. The letter of the support has to include the project, not just support for your organisation. It can't be the letters you used last time. They have to be current, particularly in this job landscape. Things are changing rapidly with small businesses and the workforce and the job market. So using a letter of support from 12 months ago is just not going to cut it. It might not actually, the content of it might actually be relevant or even applicable anymore. So we need to make sure those letters of support from employers, business, industry, and other organisations are actually current for this funding round. Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Lisa?
Yeah, I do. I often see letters of support. You might apply for multiple projects, and I see letters of support supporting your multiple projects. That makes it very confusing at our end because we're not sure which one. Sometimes the letter might be for.
Yeah.
And also, when letters aren't from local employers, they might be a statewide employer. It makes us also question whether the letter is supporting the project in our region. So just little things. So it's really just common sense. It's got to support the project. And I know that makes it, that's more work, but we would just mark it lower compared to other applicants. Yeah. And you can also, it's not just the employment we want to see. Sometimes if it's a letter of support saying they're going to offer work experience, opportunities to offer work trials, opportunities to come and guest speaking, and, or to view their workplace. They're all things that we value in seeing in a letter of support. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Liz. That was really good feedback. So straight from someone who's going to be looking at these applications and project ideas, there's lots of things to be including in the letters of support. And I think the letters of support are a really good testing ground for your partnership relationships anyway. If you're struggling to get a letter of support from an organisation, particularly for things like in-kind support, it's a pretty good indicator of how things are going to go down the track. So it's, this is the time to really be working on making sure the people you're wanting to partner with or get something from in-kind support share your vision and are happy to do it. And the work that goes into getting a letter of support together shows Desbert, the funder, that you've done that work, that it's really clear to everyone involved in the project who's supplying what and what the expectation is. Okay, and again, make sure the things you're attaching are relevant for your region and your project. That's a common mistake if you're applying across multiple regions.
Can I just add a little tiny thing, and I know it's probably more for our convenience. When we get the applications, just so people know, you know how you upload them into each section, your letters of support? When we actually see them, they're all together, in one big folder. So and it might be good for you to organise when you're organising your application, is just to use a naming convention so that all letters of support, have got, letter of support or the acronym LOS or something like that in it. So it makes it easier for us to find them, because I know lots of organisations have, 10, 20, 30 letters of support, and we read every one of them, just so you know. And other attachments and use the same to identify them. That way it makes it easy when you've got your portfolio together, your electronic portfolio, to know that you're actually putting in the right letter or piece of evidence in your application for the relevant application.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. Like you said, it stops the mistake of accidentally attaching the wrong thing, but I didn't realise that. I didn't know that you got all the, it's hard for us to know how you receive it on the other end, so that's actually a really useful thing to know. The naming convention idea is a good tip. Thank you. Okay, so don't forget to include your audited financial statements. You must include 2 years of audited statements. Your 2 most recent reports. It's a common mistake of those submitting applications to use old versions of things, letters of support, like we've said, old summaries, writing, and this goes straight to Lisa's suggestion that she just made, which is using naming conventions that make sure you don't do that. Now, if you're successful, congratulations in obtaining that funding, but make sure you read your service agreement. So there's some very specific requirements around the accounting for Skilling Queenslanders for work. You may need a separate bank account unless you have the accounting or financial management system, which is sophisticated enough to extract transactions relating to the project. So that kind of thing is very difficult to rectify when you're already multiple months down the track. So make sure you've got that stuff sorted out right from the get-go. Our last step in this band is to edit and proofread and attach and triple check and nailing it, really. So often by the time we finish writing an application, we're so close to the deadline, there's not a lot of time left for finessing, but it's a really important step, and it can be the difference between your application looking okay or really polished and really professional and really well thought out. So make sure you have built in some time in the process for proofreading and editing. And then the last stage is to breathe out, reflect, ask for feedback, and repeat the process. So let's talk a little bit about proofreading. I've got some tips here for you. Okay, so first, make it clear. Your response should be clearly written. By this, I mean use simple and direct language using a predominantly active voice. And interestingly, there's evidence to say that people are more likely to believe what you have written when it is simple to understand. So we're not using fancy language or things to impress the reader. What they'll be impressed by is a really clear project idea and something that they don't need to, search to find the meaning in. So we're losing words that don't add value, like really, basically, actually. We're avoiding jargon. We're using adverbs. So some of those are an example there. We had that example in the writing before with a very significant increase. We don't need to write very significant increase. There has been a significant increase is enough. And yeah, using simple language. So use instead of utilize, need instead of require. Just make it really clean and neat writing. Make it concise. So less is more, but make sure it's enough. So when I say that, it's about using your best examples and evidence. I referenced this before. Your assessor doesn't need to read about 15 different projects that you've done previously if they don't actually have a lot to do with what you're looking to deliver this time. What they would like to see is one or two really good examples of when you've done similar work. So use your best examples, not all of your examples. You can use acronyms and abbreviations, but use them wisely. So don't assume the reader knows what they mean. The general writing tip here is that you can use the full name of acronym first, and then you can put the acronym in brackets and then use the acronym for the rest of the writing. Obviously, ones that are very obvious and commonly known, you may not need to do that. But again, don't assume the assessor knows all the acronyms used in your industry. Get to the point. And avoid, again, irrelevant examples. Even if they're great examples of good work, if they don't really have anything to do with what you're trying to evidence in your assessment criteria, then they're not really serving a purpose. Make it comprehensive. So I spoke about being, making things, you're not waffling on too much or wasting your word count. But your answer must be comprehensive. You can't just cherry pick the bits you feel comfortable with or the bits that you do have an answer for, and then, kind of ignore the parts of the assessment criteria that you haven't really thought too much about. Remember, your answer is being scored on each criteria and likely on subcomponents of each criteria. So if you're being asked to describe your project and the evidence base that underpins it and talk about how it will achieve the outcomes, it's likely that the panel has a scoring matrix of some sort that allocates a scoring system to all those elements of that assessment criteria. If you spend all of your word count focusing on two of them, you're really limiting your score, because you might get top marks for those two aspects that you really responded to well, but you'll get nothing or very little for the aspect that you didn't really give any attention to. So brilliant writing in one part of the criteria will not make up for a lack of writing in the rest of the criteria. So be really mindful of that. Avoid making unsubstantiated claims or failing to provide evidence. The onus is on you as the writer to back up claims that you make. If you can't evidence it, or you've got nothing to back it up, don't say it. And make it persuasive. So being simple and clear, using the same types of language or buzzwords as the funder can be helpful in this regard. So when we're saying make it persuasive, we're obviously not saying to be exaggerating or persuading the reader of anything that's not true. But things are more persuasive when they're clear, when there's good evidence provided, when you use similar language to them, Again, like, for example, the budget, when they can see actually, yeah, that looks accurate, that all of those figures seem to be in line with what we've previously seen, not some very, large calculation where they can't really see where it came from. That's the opposite of persuasive. That starts to make them doubt what's going on in this application. And keep it on point. So your answer could be everything we've just talked about, but if your points are not relevant to the tender opportunity, it won't help. So being relevant is a critical feature of a good response. Make sure your points link to the requirements of the particular tender or grant, and focus on the benefits you're offering to the funder to maximise the relevance. Now, here's a little proofreading tip here. You can see in this shaded box here, instead of, perhaps you could try to reduce word count by looking to see if it's possible maybe to attempt to remove indecision. We can say exactly the same thing with far less words. You could reduce words by removing indecision. Exactly the same message, far clearer and nicer to read for the assessor too. So an exaggerated but good example of how proofreading can really make it read a lot better from the assessor's standpoint. And if you're looking to remember all of those tips, clear, concise, comprehensive, persuasive, and on point, you can just think of C3PO. Hopefully you've watched Star Wars and you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so if you need some extra help, now this won't be new information to you, that our brains will not pick up on mistakes, or usually will not pick up on mistakes in our own writing, because our brain knows what we were intending to write and we gloss over it when we read it again. This is why we can read something multiple times and then someone else will look at it and pick up on a typo. So it's really important that someone else looks at your writing. I strongly recommend that you get another human being to independently review your application, and preferably someone who hasn't worked on the submission, because they will give you really good feedback as to whether or not the project idea is clear enough, from someone who has not been involved in the thinking process at all. It will be a little more difficult for someone who's been involved in the process to give you that kind of level of feedback, because again, they know what the project's about, so they're probably not going to pick up on it not being clear enough in the application as much as someone who's coming from the outside. Now, these, Maria's just popped this in the chat, there are some apps out there who will give you immediate feedback on your writing. So they're editing tools. The Hemingway app is one of them. There's also one called Grammarly. They help you, they give you immediate feedback. So you can copy and paste in your content, and they will tell you when there's probably a better word you could have used, or you have got unnecessary words in there. That can be really helpful, particularly if you don't have someone there available to proofread, or for whatever reason that hasn't panned out and they're not there on the day that they need to be doing it, but you do want to run it through some kind of check. Those apps can be very useful. Good one for small organisations in particular to keep in mind. And make sure you got all your attachments and that they're right ones. So back to Lisa's naming convention suggestion, make sure you've got your current attachments ready to attach to this submission. And breathe. Well done. You've submitted it. It's gone. Remember, once you've hit submit, there's no going back. So making sure we're very ready before we click the button. But look, I do want to mention here again that Skilling Queenslanders for Work is here to stay for the time being. So there's opportunity to refine your ideas on the projects and apply for funding again, or even to just wait until the next round for this one. If you've listened to the webinar up until this point, you think, actually, I'm not sure we've got enough time to get all of that together before we are submitting, that's okay. I recommend you start working on it now, and you will have a great application ready for next time around in the second half of the year. So if you're successful, it's still worth getting feedback on what was good so that you can use that for future applications. And if you're not, I would recommend asking Desbert for some feedback on what could have been refined in your application. Now, I've included a link here, and we'll put it in the post-event email as well, on some questions to ask on reading the conditions of your funding agreement. So looking at that service agreement that you've got, any funding that you're receiving, it's a good idea to ensure you understand all the conditions attached to a grant. Okay, now I'm going to be shifting gears now and talking about the Human Rights Act and the Child Safe Principles. So I wanted to check to see if there was any questions before I move on. Any comments that you want to make, Lisa, at this stage, or any questions from participants? You've been very quiet so far.
It's Lisa. I will just reiterate a couple of things.
Sure.
Service agreement, read it before you apply and make sure you can. So just reiterating what you've said, you can fulfill the requirements of that service agreement. So put a checklist next to every point or every paragraph, because you're signing a contract. To make sure that you can. So you might want to put a risk factor next to it, or a yes and no, maybe what we can do to bring us up to that point so we can fulfill our service agreement. If you're lucky, if you are successful, remember that your application forms part of that contract with us. And if you tell us that you're going to be doing something in your application, in any part of your application, you have to make sure that you can do it. If you can't do it, don't put it in. And be consistent what you say in each section of your application. If you say you're going to do something in your project plan and it's not in your strategies to assist, just it's part of that proofreading, I suppose, that it's consistent there. And again, when you're successful, I just remind people that that monthly reporting part, there's always a section in there for evaluation. So you can evaluate your program as you go. What's worked well, what hasn't worked well. And you can let us know in there, because you'll be evaluating it along the way, not just at the end, so that you can make improvements and changes. This last couple of years have been crazy. And you know, you've done your own thinking and risk analysis during the running of your project, but let us know in that report. That's a good way to evaluate, and then you can bring it all together at the end in your final report, so it's not just a big job right at the end. That's it. Thanks. I hope that helps people.
Yeah, great tips. Thanks, Lisa. All those are really relevant and useful for us to consider. And again, you know, it's same as with the budget. It doesn't serve anyone to be unrealistic about what your organisation can or can't do. It's actually so stressful for the people involved in delivering something when an organisation has gained funding for something they can't actually realistically deliver. It's not fun for anyone involved, not for Desbert, not for the organisation, and definitely doesn't, serve you well for, serve you well for, I've got school-aged children at home today, serve you well for future applications, because that will obviously have that experience that hasn't gone well between you and your funder will have some bearing on future opportunities.
I didn't catch that. Could you try again?
Oh, my phone is telling me that she didn't understand what I just said. Okay, so shifting gears and talking about the Human Rights Act and the National Principles for Child-Safe Organisations. Now, if you're successful in obtaining a grant, these are two documents that you will need to be aware of and understand the implications for your project. I'm going to go through these quickly. We've only got 15 minutes left, so I'm going to go through them quite quickly because there's a lot of information available online for these. Now, hopefully you are somewhat familiar with these documents, particularly the Human Rights Act. It has been out for a while now. Okay, so for the Human Rights Act, this started on the 1st of January 2020 and it lists 23 human rights. So modern human rights law has evolved since the late 1940s, initially in response to the atrocities of World War II, when the world said, we can't have these things happen again. And so there's been this evolution of human rights law. And Australia has signed most of the existing international human rights treaties, but it's only when those rights are incorporated into domestic legislation that they can really be properly protected. So Queensland was the third state or territory to introduce the human rights legislation in Australia. So we had the ACT in 2004 and Victoria in 2006. Now, this is where it comes into how it applies to you. So the Human Rights Act applies to public entities in Queensland. That's who has responsibility to ensure they comply with the Human Rights Act. And a public entity is an organisational body performing a public function in and for Queensland. So there's two types of public entities. So core public entities are bodies like DESBIT, or the Queensland Police Force, or a state school or hospital, local government, all the government departments, those kinds of entities. A functional public entity are public entities when they're performing a function of public nature on behalf of the state. So if you're a community organisation delivering a program with Queensland government money, you are a functional public entity at that while you're delivering it. And that's why you need to be very aware of your obligations under the Human Rights Act. So you fall into the category when you're delivering services on behalf of government, and at those times you're really considered like an extension of government. Now, if you think about things from the perspective of the participants you support with multiple and complex needs, there are many systems they move within and agencies who make decisions on their behalf that affect them and their livelihoods and their welfare all of the time. So it's really important for the people working on your program to understand how the Human Rights Act affects their work. Who has human rights? So only individuals in Queensland have human rights, not organisations or businesses. And here we've simplified them by using these icons, but there's a lot of information on the Queensland Human Rights Commission website. There's professional development on there if you would like to get more familiar with them. Now, the things that might be a bit more applicable to you and the work that you're doing, particularly for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, might be section 17. Where is that one? We've got it here. So protection from torture or cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment. Let's think about institutional settings, education settings, physical labour, things that we're getting participants to do, making sure it's not that we're complying with the Human Rights Act. Privacy and reputation, section 25. 27, cultural rights. Section 28, cultural rights specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So my understanding is that Queensland is the only state that has specifically protected that right. And number 36, the right to education. So just being aware of these rights and being familiar with the Human Rights Act generally is a really good idea, because you are, as a functional public entity, if you gain this funding, an extension of the Queensland government. Now, national principles for child-safe organisations. So lots of you will be familiar with the fact that there was a Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, and that Royal Commission uncovered some really shocking abuse of children in institutions. And there were many recommendations that came out of that commission to make the country safer for children. And what came out of that was the development of the National Principles for Child-Safe Organisations as a key national reform, which has been endorsed by all states and territories now. And they provide a nationally consistent approach to embedding child-safe cultures within organisations that engage with children and act as a vehicle to give effect to the Royal Commission's recommendations. So a child-safe organisation systematically creates an environment where safety and wellbeing is core, has genuine engagement with and value of children, creates conditions that definitely reduce the likelihood of harm to children and young people, creates conditions that increase the likelihood of identifying harm, and responds to any concerns, disclosures, allegations, or suspicions. These are the 10 principles. A lot of detail against these 10 principles are available in the National Principles for Child Safe Organisations document, which we'll share with you. And it goes into a detail for each of the principles, but also includes indicators that show that an organisation upholds the principle. So things to keep in mind with these principles. I know you might be feeling like this is a little left field as far as, because you're delivering programs to adults, but you might be delivering to children. You might be delivering to youth that might fall into the child category. But also some of your supporting services around a participant might include children and families. it's absolutely possible. So being mindful of these principles is really important. But even if you're not engaging with children, some really good principles to be aware of. Okay, that's it from me. We made it with 9 minutes to go. Maria is going to pop up, here it is, a poll. So you can let us know how you found this session. Would love to hear in the comments things that you found useful or generally what your experience was, because we've got a few more to deliver yet. So there's wriggle room for me to adapt things for the other regions who haven't had their session yet. We've got quite a few next week happening. I want to thank you for your time, and I hope that your application writing goes really well. Please don't forget to get in touch with Lisa and her team. They're waiting for your call. They want to discuss your idea with you. And thanks to Lisa too for your tips that you were able to share today. That was really useful.
You're welcome. I used to do tender writing too once upon a time.
Oh, did you? You're an expert then.
No, never.
Thanks, Casey Lee. Really good to get your feedback. I hope you all enjoy your the rest of your day and that you stay dry. It's a little hard to know what's going to be happening over in the next couple of days, depending on where you are in the state. So I hope you all stay safe and dry and you've got somewhere cozy to stay.